Mark Cheng wasn't supposed to be in his lab today. He had promised his wife, Emma, that they'd spend the weekend doing something normal, something with actual human interaction and less thinking about the gravitational waves of the universe. Yet here he was, hunched over a cluttered desk in his basement lab, his fingers frantically typing equations that didn't make sense. For a man who spent his days working on the strangest scientific theories, it was the first time in a while that he felt like he was on the brink of something big, or, at least, disastrous. That he scratched his unkempt hair, stared at the blinking lights of his machine, and let out a sigh. The theory was simple enough. If he could manipulate gravitational waves on a small scale, he might be able to figure out how to make space travel more efficient. He was building a machine to tweak the very forces that governed the movement of planets, stars, and light itself. Just a small, harmless experiment. Nothing catastrophic could happen, right? With a deep breath, Mark pulled the lever on the side of the machine. It whirred to life, the lights flashing brighter, and the hum grew louder. He barely registered the faint rumbling beneath his feet at first. Then the floor beneath him seemed to shudder, and the whole room flickered as if he'd inadvertently created a mini earthquake. The machine groaned and let out a whiny whimper. A low groan escaped Mark's throat. Oh. That's not supposed to happen. Before he could even turn off the machine, the rumbling escalated. The walls of the lab buckled, and in a moment of horror, Mark realized that he was slowly, and uncontrollably, lifting off the ground. He grabbed the desk in front of him, but his hands just slid through the air like he was trying to hold on to smoke. He blinked, eyes wide, as the room around him tilted crazily. Papers and coffee mugs started floating too, drifting around like they had all decided to join him in some cosmic dance. Mark tried to reach for the nearest solid object, but by the time his fingers were close, the desk had gone airborne too. What in the name of? Mark's voice trailed off as he realized that something far worse than a broken experiment was happening. The entire Earth seemed to be floating. He peeked out the lab window to find a car parked outside, now hovering about 5 feet above the street. His neighbor's lawnmower was slowly drifting up, as if it had no care for the laws of gravity. And to top it off, he could hear someone screaming, followed by a thud, then another scream. Mark hurried outside and looked up just in time to see a woman, his neighbor, Mrs. Hernandez, floating by with a look of absolute panic on her face. Help! Someone help! She screamed, flailing her arms as she floated into the sky, completely out of control. Mark's first instinct was to run after her, but then he froze, realizing that running was a pointless endeavor when everything, including himself, was floating away. He grabbed the closest tree and tried to steady himself, but he was already drifting higher. Okay, I really messed up this time, he muttered to himself, trying to regain some sense of composure, but it was useless. The gravity, if it could even still be called that, had shifted. There was no telling how high people could go, or if they would ever come back down. The world had gone completely haywire. The scene outside his lab had turned into a surreal chaos of people floating aimlessly, crashing into buildings, cars, and lampposts. All around him, he could hear panicked shouts from the streets and a chorus of bewildered voices echoing from above. No one knew what was happening, not even the government, as Mark soon learned from a frantic call he made to his best friend, Dave, who worked in the National Weather Service. Dave. What the heck's going on? Mark shouted into the phone, barely able to hear over the background noise of muffled voices and sirens. You're telling me you don't know? Dave yelled back. Dude, I've never seen anything like this in my life. It's global. Everyone's floating. I thought it was some weird weather anomaly at first, but no. We all, have no idea what happened. Mark bit his lip. The fear in Dave's voice was real, and suddenly Mark didn't feel so alone in this madness. He turned back to the lab, his mind spinning as rapidly as the machine he had been trying to perfect. Something he did, or more precisely, something his machine did, had caused Earth's gravity to completely vanish, or at least weaken to the point where no one could stay grounded. For a long moment, Mark stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. The reality of the situation was slowly dawning on him. He wasn't just about to be fired for destroying his career, he was about to become the reason the entire planet was floating through space. It wasn't just his neighborhood. From the footage on the news, Mark saw people from all around the world floating in various stages of panic. Some clung to buildings or trees, others were caught up in the wind, drifting like ragdolls. Planes and helicopters were attempting to make emergency landings, but without gravity, those landing attempts were clumsy and futile. All the normal rhythms of life had ceased, and what remained was a planet-wide struggle for control. Mark's brain raced as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. The whole of humanity was at the mercy of his mistake. The situation was beyond a mere scientific conundrum, it was an existential crisis. He had to fix it. There had to be some way to reverse the effect, but how? He sat down, trying to organize his thoughts as the lab slowly turned into a floating mess of equipment. He needed help, but not from just anyone, he needed the best minds in the world. This wasn't just a theoretical issue, this was real, this was urgent. And there was one person he thought could help him, Dr. Sarah Hargrove, a leading physicist and one of the few people who could help him understand the nature of gravitational anomalies on this scale. "Sarah, it's me," Mark said, reaching out for her contact number. "We've got a problem." Before he could continue, the world around him seemed to tilt again, and his phone slipped from his hand. He lunged to catch it, but instead found himself floating back toward the ceiling. Mark's stomach lurched as his feet left the floor, sending a shock of panic coursing through him. It wasn't until he felt his body slowing its ascent, just as gravity seemed to kick back in momentarily, that he realized what had just happened. The gravity wasn't completely gone, it was fluctuating, shifting in unpredictable waves. "Oh, this is bad. This is so bad," Mark muttered as he floated down, coming to a precarious stop, hovering above his desk. Outside, the world had gone completely mad, but Mark had no choice but to solve the problem. He had to fix this. He had to undo the mess he had made, and somehow, he was sure that fixing Earth's gravity wasn't the only challenge awaiting him. Mark gritted his teeth as he floated back down, the lack of gravity still making his movements clumsy and unpredictable. His hands reached for the lab's table, but the second his fingers brushed against it, the table slid out of the way as though it had a mind of its own. Frustration bloomed in his chest. This was supposed to be a controlled experiment, something that could advance human understanding of gravitational waves. Instead, he had created a global catastrophe. He glanced toward the window again. Cars, people, even entire buildings were drifting upward. The city was in chaos. But there was something else, something more unsettling. The longer he watched, the more Mark realized that this wasn't just the result of his machine, it was a systemic issue. Gravity itself was broken. It was malfunctioning, jumping in and out like a switch was being flicked. As he drifted back toward the door, Mark's thoughts swirled. If the gravity was fluctuating in such a random, violent way, what did that mean for the planet's stability? For people who weren't prepared for something like this, there was no telling how long they could survive in this new, alien version of Earth. Cities could fall apart, lives could be lost. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a global emergency. With a sense of urgency, Mark reached for his phone again. His hands felt like they belonged to someone else, as they fumbled with the screen, trying to bring up Sarah's number. He found it after a few frustrating seconds of floating aimlessly, and he pressed the dial button with a mix of hope and dread. The phone buzzed twice before Sarah's voice came through the line, distant but clear. "Mark? Is that you? What's going on? I saw the news. Are you okay?" Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of concern he could hear. "I'm fine. I think. But listen, I've messed up big time. I've caused something. I don't know what to call it, but I think Earth's gravity is malfunctioning." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by an exhale. "You think? Or is it definitely malfunctioning?" Mark's grip tightened on the phone, his frustration creeping back in. "It's definitely malfunctioning. People are floating everywhere, Sarah. Buildings are losing their foundations, and cars are flying around. We're losing control of gravity itself. I don't know how, but I need your help. A beat of silence stretched out before Sarah's voice came back. Okay. Don't panic, but we need to talk. Are you still in your lab? You need to get out of there. The only way to fix this is to figure out what exactly you did to cause it. He sighed. I didn't mean to cause it. It was just an experiment, something small, but I think it opened up some kind of rift. A rift in gravity. I've been running calculations, but they don't make sense anymore. This thing is way bigger than I thought. Mark floated to the window once more, gazing out at the wild sight below. Everything seemed to be suspended in a moment of madness, frozen in mid-air as though gravity had simply thrown its hands up in surrender. Listen, I'm not far from you, Sarah said, breaking through his spiral of thoughts. I'm going to head over there. Keep yourself safe. Whatever you did, it sounds like it might have opened something else up. You're not the only one dealing with this. Mark froze. What do you mean? What else is out there? Another pause. It's hard to explain over the phone. Just wait for me. I'll be there soon. Mark barely processed her words before the line went dead. The gravity fluctuations were making everything harder, from thinking clearly to simply existing in this bizarre, ever-shifting space. The world outside was a mess, and there was only one thing Mark was sure of. He had to fix this. He floated aimlessly around the lab for a while, staring at the equipment, trying to gather his thoughts. A sudden, startling thought gripped him. What if this was bigger than just Earth? What if this had somehow opened a gateway to another place, a place where gravity wasn't broken, but where something else entirely was at stake? He rubbed his eyes, trying to stay focused. His theories had always been abstract, but now they seemed to bleed into reality. The idea of alternate worlds, parallel universes, things that once seemed like mere speculation, now felt far too real. And the more he thought about it, the more he felt like something was calling to him, beckoning from beyond the rift. Minutes later, Mark was snapped from his reverie by a loud knock at the door. It was Sarah, her figure framed against the floating debris outside, her own expression tense. Come on, open up, she shouted. Mark floated toward the door, which was now higher up than he remembered it being, and swung it open. Sarah entered quickly, her lab coat trailing behind her as she adjusted to the odd gravity around her. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, taking in the floating papers and scientific equipment, before settling on Mark. Okay, she said, her voice firm but measured. Explain it to me. What exactly did you do? Mark ran a hand through his hair, his mind still racing. I was experimenting with gravitational waves, just a small-scale project, nothing too fancy. But then, I must have triggered something. Maybe it was too much energy, maybe it was the way the machine interacted with Earth's natural gravitational fields. I'm not sure, but whatever it was, it's opened a breach. A rift in gravity. And now, we're paying the price for it. Sarah's eyes narrowed. You're telling me that you've opened some kind of hole? A hole in gravity? Mark nodded. Not just gravity. It's like the laws of physics themselves are breaking down. The whole planet is starting to float. And there's no telling where it'll stop. Great, Sarah muttered, clearly trying to process the scope of the situation. So, where do we even begin? This isn't something we can just fix with a new machine, Mark. I know. It's not just about fixing the machine. We need to understand what caused the rift, really understand it. If we don't, this whole thing could spiral completely out of control. And if gravity keeps fluctuating like this, there's no telling what might happen. What if it escalates? Sarah looked around again, her brow furrowing. I'll help you, but I think we need to look beyond Earth. This might not just be a problem with our gravity. I think there's something more at play here. Something beyond our world. Mark froze. He hadn't voiced the nagging thought in his head, but Sarah had. You think this could be something from another world? She nodded. Maybe. And if that's the case, we might have to consider that whatever is out there is watching us. And maybe even waiting for us to fix this. Mark swallowed hard, his stomach churning. You mean it's not just an accident? I don't think so, Sarah replied, her voice grave. But we need to find out. Just then, the lab's equipment began to beep erratically. The gravitational fluctuations seemed to intensify again, as if responding to their conversation. Mark looked at Sarah, his eyes wide with concern. Looks like we don't have much time. Whatever this is, it's coming for us. Mark and Sarah exchanged a quick, worried glance as the hum from the machine intensified. The sound was almost like a steady pulse, rhythmic and threatening, as though it was a heartbeat, one that didn't belong to Earth. Mark felt the ground, or what passed for the ground, shudder once more, and suddenly, everything in the lab lurched upward again, the heavy equipment swaying dangerously in the air. It was like the machine was feeding off the chaos, amplifying the disruption in gravity. The walls buckled again, and once more, Mark and Sarah found themselves suspended mid-air. Mark grabbed Sarah's arm. We can't just keep floating around like this. We need to figure out where this rift is, now, before it completely destabilizes everything. Sarah's eyes were narrowed with focus. The rift. You said it wasn't just gravity, right? If we're talking about a breach in reality itself, that means there's more going on here than just your machine. We might be dealing with something beyond physics. Something that doesn't just affect our world, but another world too. Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Mark could already feel the weight of them pushing down on his thoughts. He had always thought of alternate worlds as theoretical, something from science fiction, a distant dream in the corner of academia. But now, as gravity itself twisted and folded in on itself, Mark could no longer deny it. The rift wasn't just an anomaly. It was a doorway, and it was opening wider with each passing moment. I didn't just break gravity, Mark muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. I think I opened something else. Something beyond our understanding, Sarah finished for him. And we don't know what kind of consequences this might have for both worlds. If this rift is unstable, it could tear through both realities, ours and whatever lies on the other side. Mark felt a chill run through him. What if whatever is out there is trying to reach us? Sarah's eyes flickered with a moment of understanding, and then they hardened with resolve. Then we need to figure out how to close that rift. And quickly. They both turned to the machine. It was thrumming now, humming in an erratic rhythm, pulsing with energy. As the gravity fluctuations intensified, Mark could feel a strange pull coming from the rift, an invisible force drawing him in. It wasn't just physical now, there was something almost sentient about the way it moved. We can't just reverse the polarity or shut it off, Sarah said, her voice quiet but sharp with realization. If we mess with it too much, we might make things worse. Mark took a deep breath. He had to think clearly. We need a way to stabilize it, to slow the effects. We don't have much time before the whole planet's sucked into whatever's on the other side. Before Sarah could respond, the floor beneath them jolted again, throwing them both off balance. Mark reached out, but it was too late. The lab door slammed open with a force that made the walls crack, and a blinding light flooded into the room, washing over them. Mark squinted against the light, shielding his eyes, and then, as if the air itself had thinned, something emerged through the rift. At first, it was just a faint shadow, a flickering shape that seemed to dance with the light, distorting with the fluctuation of gravity. But then it took form, an ethereal being, humanoid, but translucent, shimmering with a strange, otherworldly glow. Its shape was fluid, almost like smoke, but there was an undeniable intelligence in its presence. It wasn't a creature from their world. It didn't belong here, Sarah gasped. What is that? Mark's breath caught in his throat. I think it's from the other side. The figure hovered in mid-air, its movement deliberate, slow, as if studying them. There was no sound at first, no voice, just the strange hum of the machine and the crackling energy of the rift. Mark couldn't tear his eyes away. The entity seemed to be aware of them, aware of their presence, as if it had been waiting for them all along. I don't think it's dangerous, Mark said, his voice tentative. At least not yet. It's communicating somehow, but not with words. Maybe it's trying to understand us. Sarah looked skeptical. Or it's trying to manipulate us. Mark shook his head. We need to figure out what it wants. The rift's pulling in more energy from both sides. It might not just be an accidental breach anymore. This could be an invitation, or a test. The entity hovered closer, and a strange sensation washed over Mark. It was as if his very mind was being probed, sifted through by an invisible force. It was an eerie feeling, almost like the being was reading his thoughts, delving into his consciousness without effort. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the entity reached out. It wasn't a physical gesture, it didn't need to touch him. The air around Mark seemed to bend in response, and before he could react, a flash of light enveloped him, and in the span of a breath, everything changed. Mark was no longer in the lab. He was standing on what appeared to be solid ground, but it wasn't Earth. The air was different here, thin, almost weightless, yet rich with an unfamiliar energy that vibrated with each breath he took. The sky above him was not the familiar blue of Earth, but a swirling mass of iridescent colors, like the aurora borealis had exploded into the atmosphere and stayed there. Mark blinked, trying to orient himself. Where was he? How had he gotten here, Mark? Sarah's voice broke through his confusion, but it didn't sound the way it had before. It echoed, as if she were standing miles away, her voice distorted by the strange environment. Mark, where are you? He looked around, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to move, but it felt like the ground beneath him was constantly shifting, slipping through his feet. It was disorienting, and for a moment, he felt as though he was floating again, suspended in the air without a solid footing. The gravity, or lack of it, made his limbs feel weightless, his movements sluggish, like he was stuck in a dream. Before he could gather his thoughts, the entity materialized again, this time standing before him. Its form had solidified slightly, though it still shimmered with an ethereal glow. It tilted its head, as if appraising him, before speaking, not in words, but in a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to resonate directly in Mark's mind. That it wasn't language, at least not in the way he understood it. But somehow, Mark could feel the meaning, the urgency behind its presence. The rift wasn't an accident, as Mark had hoped. It was a cry for help. The entity was reaching out, not just to him, but to both worlds. The gravitational breach wasn't something that could be reversed easily. It was a link between worlds, a fragile bridge that had to be stabilized, or it would collapse, taking both Earth and this strange, gravity-less civilization with it. Mark's mind raced. He understood the stakes now. This wasn't just a scientific problem, it was a cosmic one, one that involved the survival of entire worlds. And it all depended on him. What do I need to do? Mark whispered, not sure if the entity would hear him. The entity shifted closer, and Mark felt the pressure of its intent in his chest, like an invisible weight. It was clear now. He wasn't just here as an observer. He was here to act, to fix what he had broken. He was the key, whether he liked it or not. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. This was the moment. The rift had been torn open, but with his knowledge and the entity's guidance, perhaps, just perhaps, he could sew it back together. A voice, deep and alien, resonated through the air. This time, he could understand it. You are the bridge. You must restore balance. Mark nodded slowly. He didn't know how or if it would work, but he knew what had to be done. It was time to stop floating.